My childhood is the first two words that come into mind. When I was one of those nerd kids in the 80s who spent their kind of all their time in a darkened bedroom hacking away on games.
Jetpack. There was my misspent youth playing Jetpack over, I can't remember, somewhere 84, 85, something like that.
Probably C5. The beauty of them was that you could understand the entire computer. You could understand the entire computer, the operating system, the basic language that was built in, and so on.
The best time I ever had as a computer scientist was when I was programming the Spectrum, age 16 or 17.
Loading screens, failed loading, turning tapes over, banging them or something like that.
This video is brought to you by the letters Z and X and the number 81.
Yeah, I'm just collecting a few memories of people who've been on Computerphile, who've memories of Sinclair, and the one thing I thought you could perhaps bring to the table is a bit of a memory of the man himself, because we've talked about his machines before, you and I, on Computerphile. What was Sir Clive like?
I have to say, probably before we even start, I'm probably a little bit of a fraud on that score, because a lot of my memories of Sir Clive are other people's memories, right? I've spoken to enough people that I feel I know the guy well, but I met him once. And so from my point of view, my personal memories is the guy was an absolute gentleman, and he was engaging. He was interested in what we were doing. Then there's interviews that I've done with a lot of people that have either worked for him or worked with him and that sort of thing. And there's two sides to the coin, as there always is, and the biggest question I get is about Micromen. Was he really like he's portrayed in Micromen? For
viewers who perhaps aren't aware of this, maybe viewers in the States, this is a TV movie which may or may not be available on YouTube. I shall not, if you were to search for Micromen, you may come across it.
No, you definitely will.
I was just trying to be...
You look back at the 1980s or the late 1970s, we're at a time where computers were quite scary, right? There were these big, expensive things, and so Clive Sinclair came in and broke through, made the first big mass market, mass appeal, cheap computers that people were able to program and create their own things on. Started with the ZX80 in 1980. A year later, created the ZX81. And then the year after that, created the famous ZX Spectrum as well, which is kind of the cornerstone for a lot of the British kind of UK software and video game development industry.
Well, it changed my life completely. I'm sure many people are going to say the same thing. I mean, I wouldn't be a computer scientist and sitting here today in a computer science department if it wasn't for Clive Sinclair. So as many people, I started about the age of 14. One of my friends got a ZX81 and I was very envious, and we spent all our spare time at his house typing in games from magazines. And in those days, the magazines came out every week, and they had machine code games in hexadecimal, which you had to type in very, very carefully. If you made one single mistake, everything crashed and you had to start from scratch. So we got very good at typing in these games, and that's kind of what got me started in the Sinclair machines.
In the media, they're sort of made out almost, there's an element of making them out to almost be a joke in some forms. The little ZX80 with this white case and the extra memory pack you had to put on the back, and how it would always wobble and you needed to cool it down with a pint of milk, a Tetra Pak of milk, and the little plastic keys. It's actually fantastic design. I mean, so absolutely ingenious is one word which comes to my mind. It was actually an incredibly skillful piece of engineering and an incredibly creative piece of engineering.
I started off with a ZX81, loved it, and then graduated to ZX Spectrum. And I have a vivid memory of the ZX Spectrum, bringing it home, plugging it into the TV, putting the cassette in, and it making noises, and then in colour, up comes a rainbow on the screen, line by line. It's like, oh, we've entered the 21st century now. It was just amazing.
You have a starring role in Micromen, the film.
Yeah, well, no, I don't have a starring role. I played a silly bit part and looked like a Muppet. But we did do all the computers for it and supplied the tech and advised on various aspects from a technical point of view. As did Clive, actually, and as did many other people. When people find out that we were involved with it, it is a film that's gone down really well with everybody. It seems to have anyway, and it's great that we played our part in it. But a big question we get is, was Sir Clive really, like he was in the film? Because he was extremely shouty and sweary, and was he really like that? And the answer that I can best judge from the conversations that I've had is absolutely he was. However, the film is set at a time when he had his back against the wall. He was trying to get the contract for the BBC computer, and he didn't get it, and things were not going well for him. And in those situations, yes, he was like that. And in fact, various people have said he was underplayed on that front. It sometimes wasn't suitable for TV.
We got a ZX81 for Christmas. Not this one. This one I picked up off someone a few years ago. It still works apart from a few keys on the keyboard. But we got a ZX81 at home, and then about 9 months after that we upgraded to a ZX Spectrum, as did my granddad. He got one as well. So Sinclair Computers were around all the time as I was growing up until I graduated to the Atari ST and things.
The British video game industry would not look like how it looks today without the efforts of Clive Sinclair and the ZX Spectrum. DMA Design, based up in Dundee, started as a ZX Spectrum coding club. Right, and then they eventually went and made Lemmings and developed a certain game called Grand Theft Auto that obviously has been taken now, and it's grown to this huge kind of behemoth. But also loads of video game studios started off programming on things like the ZX Spectrum, and the ZX Spectrum made possible. Ultimate Play the Game, which we now know as Rare, started creating games for the ZX Spectrum, but also obviously the Commodore 64 as well. And because the ZX Spectrum was so cheap and was so mass market, it allowed anybody really to just get in and start making their own things. So, it definitely forms the foundations of what we know as the British games industry.
You literally had to say, okay, I can move little sprites around the screen, and I'm only going to be able to have like 8 or so sprites on the screen. What game could I come up with which will use that?
You had to design the games around the technical ability of the computer. So you had to look at what it could do and how it would work and how much memory, and then design your game according to it. Whereas as computer technology's got better, you design your game first and the computer has to fit it.
It's cheap, so if you look at the price of the Spectrum computers, I mean, they're ridiculously cheap for the time. I mean, I was looking at this recently and working out how much they'd cost nowadays, and it was, like 200, 300 quid or something like that, which is amazingly low priced, especially for something that's, at the forefront, effectively, of home computing at the time.
Eventually, after much pestering, I managed to persuade my parents to buy me a Sinclair Spectrum, and I think I had a paper run for about 2 years to help fund that as well. And that's when I really started getting into the programming side of things with the Sinclair machines. And what got me really hooked, and this is my oldest book, Programming the Z80 by Rodney Zacks, and the Z80 processor is what powered all the Sinclair machines. And I learned Z80 machine code about the age of 16 or 17, and I started programming my own games, and that's what really got me hooked on computer science, and that's how I became a computer science professor in the end. He
was a very, very clever guy. Let's not forget that he was a member of Mensa, and he chaired Mensa for many years, right? So he was a very clever guy, and if you didn't have the skills to be able to talk on his level, then he could quite easily become a bit shouty, but just very, very dismissive. However, on the other side of the coin, I know people who worked with him said he was incredibly generous with in many ways. One, with kind of things like Christmas presents for staff, Fortnum and Mason hampers when things were going well for all the staff, regardless of the level that they played in the company. Huge parties, can only be described as glitterati kind of parties, and they had people there from all walks of life. And they were extravagant and they were fantastic and people really enjoyed them. So much so that a lot of people can't remember them. So he was very, very generous and he was a really nice guy. Even somebody that cuts his grass for him, would be given a Sinclair Spectrum to, here's this for the kids, enjoy it, sort of thing.
This is one of the games which I wrote 37 years ago when I was 16. And it's a game called Hyperbole, which actually sold. Managed to get this running on an emulator a few years ago. So this is my youngest son, Tom, and this is him playing the game. I think he was about 12 at the time. So it's a little shoot 'em up game. It's not very fancy game. But yeah, when I look back at this, I'm quite surprised that a 16-year-old could write something like that. This is one of the nice things about the Sinclair machines. Even as a kid, you could understand absolutely everything about them. And actually, for me, the main challenge was doing the graphics. We used to get bits of graph paper and just color the squares in to make the little characters, and that was... Writing the program wasn't very difficult for me, but doing the graphics and making it look good was the difficult part.
Obviously, there were faults with it. I had a ZX80, the original white one, with the original 1K memory, and then as I earned a bit more money, I got the money for the 16K expansion pack, and you stuck it on the back. And it would, if it became a bit wobbly, and then it would break, and the computer would go down because you'd lost your extra 16K of RAM. And then you could find that you could tilt it and put a weight on it to get the connections were better.
I didn't have a colour monitor, so I had to go into one of the computer shops in my hometown of Glasgow and play my games on the colour monitors to make sure the graphics were all right, and then tweak the graphics and then take them home and then sell the games.
A friend of mine had a ZX Spectrum. I myself had already a PET 2001, which was 6502 based. Yeah, so I wasn't so much involved at this point. I wasn't so much involved with Z80 or Sinclair or anything, but I did program Z80, and that was when I worked in my first job for a company, Nixdorf Microprocessor Engineering, and there I did lots of Z80 assembly programming. So I know. So A9 is load accumulator to memory. I know still some of the opcodes. So it was fun. I mean, it had what's it called, a mouse piano, where every bit you could set. And everything was in hex, so it was real. You had your fingers on the real machine at the time. It was real computing, and not this fake stuff we do nowadays.
We had a Spectrum 128K Plus 2, which had a built-in tape recorder. What kind of springs to mind is just hearing the sound of binary, essentially, data. That turned into an audio signal is just such a distinctive thing. That's what a lot of people talk about when they remember the Spectrum and other sorts of machines of that time, that era. I think that's it's a really, really striking thing to be able to hear the sound of digital information.
I had a ZX81. That was my second computer, and I didn't particularly want it, but I'd ordered a BBC Micro. But the waiting lists were like, I don't know, 6 months or something when it first came out. So in the end, I fairly briefly had a second-hand ZX81 just to sort of tide me over till the BBC was delivered. The ZX81, it was kind of, it was very small, quite sort of plasticky with the weird sort of film keyboard. Every key did about 5 or 6 different things, so you'd end up doing this sort of Vulcan mind grip to type in the character you wanted.
The website has every item that we have in the collection listed on it, all of Sinclair's products of a computing nature anyway, that people can go and have a look at. There's information about Clive, there's a timeline for his products and their history and things like that. So yeah, it's all on the website.
So it gets ridiculed because it had a number of drawbacks and deficiencies, but nothing else touched it on price. Okay, this was the first machine you could really go out to the high street and buy from somebody like Boots or WH Smith's, and that was a big deal. So it's no longer looking in the backs of electronics magazines. This was walking down the high street. Oh look, there's a home computer. Should we buy one? And people did. They bought a lot of them.
I mean, actually, in the sort of early 80s, 82, 83, 84, you could walk into WH Smith's, which was a newsagents in the UK, and you'd go upstairs or to the back of the thing, and they would have as ZX Spectrums on sale, they'd have Oryx, they'd have BBC Micros, they'd have Commodore 64s and things on sale. They would sell them, they would sell the games for them, the hardware, the accessories from them, and so you'd walk in there. But it wasn't just but it wasn't just WH Smith's that sold that. You could walk into Boots, which is a chemist, a pharmacy in the UK, quite a famous one, headquartered here in Nottingham, and they would be selling computers. I can remember going upstairs to Boots in Beeston, and you'd have a ZX Spectrum, an Acorn Electron, and so on display, hooked up to TVs, and people would walk in and type 10, print, hello world, 20, go to 10, and...
Often a ruder kind of phrase than hello world, but yes.
Not in the areas I lived in, sure. I don't know what happened where you lived.
It's easy to forget now that this was delivering a computer for £100 to someone like me. I was a 16-year-old. We had a computer at school, a microprocessor system, which was a big thing, and it was. But that was absolutely fantastic because that was a machine that you could use then and there in front of you, and we started programming that, and it was based on the Z80, the Zilog Z80 chip. So having this computer that actually had a keyboard and you could type on and you could program it, that was a massive step forward, and that was like, oh my gosh, I can use a computer. I've got a computer in front of me.
One of the nice things about all computers at that point is that they were. Computing wasn't just something that you used, it was something that you were going to sort of program with, you were going to hook it up to automate your house and do things. So they all had some sort of expansion capability. Something like the BBC Micro, it was dead easy to do things with. You had a user port on the bottom, you could connect that up to some relays and things with a few transistors, and you could start controlling your model train set or whatever it is you want to do, which is what I did. But you could do the same on the ZX Spectrum. You had the edge connector here. The edge connector is basically the processor buses from the Z80 CPU which powers the Spectrum. So you've got the address bus, you've got the data bus, you've got the I/O and the memory select signals. And if you want to hook it up to control something, you have to decode all that yourself. Now, I was 5 or 6 at the time we were doing this. I didn't understand it all, but it certainly set me on the road to understanding how the hardware worked, how you have to decode the addresses that were coming out of the CPU so that you knew that this was actually going to something that you wanted to control, and then you'd have to feed that into latches or flip-flops so that you could control it. So while it was much harder to do something like control a model train set or link this into sensors and things, and it was, say, the BBC Micro behind me, you actually learned a whole lot more about how a computer worked by doing it here. The BBC Micro is like sort of driving the GPIOs on a Raspberry Pi. You just set an address in memory and you would turn the pins on and off and you could control something. Most people bought this, they weren't going to do that, so why are you paying for that extra bit? You've still got to have a bigger motherboard that's going to cost more, you've got more fiberglass forming it, you've still got to sort of decode the addresses, leave space for the chips and things. If people aren't going to use that most of the time, why put it on the machine?
Well, I was obviously at school and I was working as a pot washer in a local restaurant to earn £5 a week or something like this, and I was reading the electronic magazines. These computers, you start buying them and they were still hundreds and hundreds of pounds, £500, £800, this sort of thing. And then suddenly this Sinclair ZX80 came out and it was $79.95 or something if you could solder it yourself. And I thought, I can't solder, I'm not an electronic engineer. But $99.99 or whatever it was, $99.95, £100. And that was a computer that I could have in my house. And it's like, well, that's fantastic. So I bought this thing and I got it home, and I remember the excitement of unpacking this thing, the realisation that it was based on the Z80 chip, which was the same as the this school computer. And so therefore at home I could have something which used the same chip as this computer I got in school.
Sinclair was huge in terms of getting me interested in coding. I really dilly-dallied over whether to do a physics degree or a computer science degree. Sinclair had a massive role to play in that.
Well, putting you off computer science?
No, actually getting me into coding. And of course with the ZX81, I started off with the 1K version like everybody did. There's not a lot you can do in 1K unless you get into assembly language. And as a means of learning assembly, it was absolutely fantastic. I also remember writing some really simple games, like it was just like a V that you had to scroll back and forth, and there was a scrolling background with little with asterisks as asteroids, and you had to use the arrow keys to move back and forth and avoid as much. I wrote that up and I sent it to one of the listings magazines, I can't remember which one, but they accepted it and I published it, and I got a check for, I believe, 25 quid, which to a 13-year-old back in 1981 or 82 was like, oh God, I'm rich. So yeah.
So this is like the magazines used to have a list of code you copied out, right?
You did, and you had to sit there and type it in, and then you'd save it onto your cassette. And then when you graduated from the 1K to the 16K version, and you had your RAM pack at the back, and the classic RAM pack wobble issue that you'd be typing away, you'd have got 90 lines or 90 pages out of 102 pages, and then suddenly your RAM pack wobbles and it's all gone. So happy days, happy times, yes.
I think there was something like 2, 4 or 8K of ROM which contained the complete operating system of the computer. And then what happened was the operating system booted up and ran, and then the operating system itself used, out of the 1K of memory, you ended up with 760 bytes of memory that you could actually use.
And what Sinclair was trying to do was engineer this down to a price, because this came out in 1981 and cost around £80, £100 if you bought it assembled, whereas other computers at the time were costing more like £1,000 or that sort of. So there was that sort of order of magnitude and different in price. So this really made computers available for the home user, particularly in Britain where there wasn't that much money available and things. People could go and buy one of these, they could start to experiment, they could start to learn how to program and things, where even something like the BBC Micro, which came out a couple of years after this, sort of late 82, early 83, was costing £300-400. This was 100 quid. You could get one of these, you could play with it and things, set it up. It used your TV, it used a standard cassette player as its storage device, and you could start to experience what computing was like. Of course, it was limited down to price. Every time you press a key, the screen flashes because it's using the CPU to drive, or it's using one aspect of the CPU to drive the display, as well as to process the instructions to run the program. So every time it's processing instructions, it can't draw things on the display. Every time it's drawing things on the display, it can't process instructions, and so you have to sort of balance between the two. Despite that, people managed to produce some really quite impressive software for the machine. Something like 3D Monster Maze is a classic example. You've sort of got almost I won't call it a first-person shooter, maybe it's a first-person maze game and so on, drawing sort of 3D mazes and a dinosaur.
It had this built-in BASIC language that could allow you to program in BASIC. That was fantastic. But I had actually learnt machine code on the Z80 in this school computer, and the Sinclair used the same Z80, so it used the same machine code. The school computer had this disassembler, and I worked with the disassembler. It had a debugger and a disassembler. So a disassembler turns the machine code numbers, the raw machine code numbers, into a sort of the text, which sort of makes it a sort of human readable form of the machine code. And I got this running. I took the school stuff and adapted it and worked it and got it working on the ZX80. And then I could disassemble the entire operating system. It was absolutely ingenious. It was absolutely fantastic. It's sort of realisation again that what it was doing was it would interrupt the processor every 50 milliseconds or something, and 50 times a second, and put a picture onto the screen. And it was sort of, so the processor was writing the image to the screen on a, and this is in the days before LCD screens. This is scanning televisions, and so it had this interrupting process which interrupted the operating system or interrupted the program and drew the pictures onto the screen. And so then when it started running a program, it would disable the interrupts and the screen would go blank. So you had the screen going blank whilst the program was running, and then when it stopped running, the screen would reappear. I remember as you read it and understood it, and then worked out. I worked out how the basic language had been coded into the system as well. So somewhere in this process, I wrote the machine code debugger and disassembler for it and sold it commercially. Started selling this commercially. Unless you've programmed in machine code, realising why you need a single step debugger. But you're trying to program stuff on a computer like this, and so yeah, I created this machine code debugger, and then we sold it commercially, bringing me income when I was a student. By this time I'd gone to university, but in 1981 or something. My machine code debugger was being sold by a company, and so they wanted me to update it from the ZX80 to the ZX81, so I did that, and then we got Spectrum, and I did the same with that, ported it to the Spectrum, and each time the machines got a little bit more sophisticated. The ZX81 was obviously more sophisticated than 80, and the Spectrum was a step up again, but they were still, absolutely ingenious. Sinclair, in the end, was what got me into computing. I mean...
he was a visionary, I think is probably a good one. He's a visionary, he was an inventor. He had, I mean, the electric bike is a classic example there. Electric scooters are everywhere now. Sinclair tried to produce one with the C5. He had the Zyke, I think it was called, a few years later. He introduced a portable computer, the Z88, was a lovely machine that he produced, which was sort of like I think it was a 6 or 7 line, 80 column LCD display with a keyboard in a machine about the size of a piece of A4 paper, probably not much thicker than that, which you could throw in a bag that had a rubber keyboard so it was resilient and things. And you had a portable machine that you could hook up and sort of take around. The battery life was ages. It came with a word processor. It actually came with BBC Basic on there. It had Richard Russell's version of BBC Basic for the Z80 on there, and he was definitely a visionary. I think perhaps my only disappointment is that the only time I saw a Sinclair C5, I wasn't able to go in it because my legs weren't long enough at that age to pedal it.
And then the fact that I wrote this debugger and so on and sold it through university was then supplementing my student income through university. So in many ways, the Sinclair ZX80, 81 and Spectrum got me through university in more ways than one. I ended up paying for my beer money as well as sparking my interest in computing.
I'm a very keen advocate for as much coding as possible in physics courses. I would almost say that, well, I would definitely say that coding is as important as mathematics in physics courses. I'm almost of the opinion now that coding is even more important than mathematics in physics courses. And yeah, so it's been with me since a very, very early age. When I think about a physics problem, and certainly during my undergraduate years, during my PhD, and even now, it's can I code this? Or see a way to code it? And if I can't code it or see a way to code it, I know I don't understand it. If I can't think of the algorithm, then I don't understand that particular piece of physics. And you know, that all goes all the way back to the ZX81, sitting in that room with the RAM pack wobbling all over the place and typing in that stuff. And it was character building, let's put it that way, Sean.
I must have been about 7 or 8, and the first computer I ever laid eyes on knowingly, or that I knew was a computer, was a Sinclair ZX81. We were playing out in the street, some friends, some neighbours, and somebody said that one of our neighbours had this computer, and we were all allowed to come in and look at it, so we all kind of filed into this room, and I don't know to this day what he was doing on the computer, probably loading a game or something, because it didn't seem like much happened. We hadn't seen anything like it before. I mean, outside of the arcades, in your home, Atari was about as far as it went. We've done videos on the Atari VCS to 2600. It was kind of like that, but you could write different games yourself. You would get these magazines, and there'd be a list of code, and you'd type that code in as faithfully as you could, and if you weren't faithful enough, it didn't work, so you had to be pretty faithful. And then you might tweak it, and you go, oh, actually, it says there, enter, press any key. It's like, I'm going to type something different there. Let's see what happens. So no, I remember, yeah, a lot of fond memories of messing around with these things.
It's been a while since I've played this.
A good amount of beer money, shall we say. I mean, you know, we're talking through my university career. I mean, this is, say, 1980 to, well, I was at university 81 to 84. I was probably making hundreds of pounds a term. Let's say hundreds of pounds a term. So over the course of my university, maybe a few £1,000s. You know, this didn't make me a billionaire. This didn't make me a Steve Jobs, but it paid for me. This was at a time when my dad became unemployed, and my mum and dad couldn't give me any money, and I was having to pay for my own way through university. And it was the money from the Sinclair ZX80 and 81 and Spectrum that basically paid my way for me through university. So in many ways, I've got a lot to I owe to the Clive Sinclair.